What's important is that in Mexico the UN got its mojo back. So we've in Copenhagen we had an agreement which was a political agreement outside of the UN process. And what's happened here is that the countries, US and China, for the first time have put their commitments into the UN process, and we've also built up the key mechanisms for financing poorer countries to get on a cleaner development pathway, but also accountability and transparency, key stumbling blocks to progress in Copenhagen.
So just on that point of developed and developing countries having targets, what was the situation before? How has that moved forward? Well,
previously under the Kyoto Protocol, only the developed countries, some 27% of the world's pollution, as that was covered. Now we have some 80%. Now commitments being put there. Now it's still short of what we need, but we've got that there, and we've got systems of transparency and accountability, the ability to ratchet those up.
What's the point if they're not legally binding?
Well, we're working our way through what the legal form was. Cancun was never actually going to solve that. That's probably for South Africa next year.
Is that a little ambitious, though?
Well, we need to see. I mean, this is a process now. What happened in Copenhagen was a complete collapse of trust and momentum, and so it's almost as important as the words on the paper is the fact that we've got trust and momentum back in track again as we look at what commitments we have, and we now have got accountability, international standard rules there where countries can have a look at what each other are doing, and in that way we can use that as a springboard for greater action.
But what about all the urgency that scientists are talking about in relation to this? When you're talking about its progress, that we've made this step and then there's going to be that step and that step, what about the urgency with scientists saying something has to happen very soon?
Well, there's no question. I mean, would I like to be in a place where we've got stronger commitments? Yes, but we're actually in a place now we've got some commitments. The scientists tell us we need to have global pollution going down by 2020, and for developed countries like Australia, well, that needs to be as soon as possible, and that's why we now turn to 2011, which is the year of action, as the Prime Minister has said, on pollution and climate change. We need to have a legislative mechanism there that can get our pollution going down the next couple of years.
Another of the things that Greg Combay mentioned was this $100 billion green fund by 2020. Now, hadn't that been spoken about before this conference and agreed to generally anyway?
No, that was in the Copenhagen political agreement outside the UN. There was very important commitments of $30 billion over the next few years, and ratcheting up to $100 billion a year of public and private money. How that money was going to be dispersed and how it was going to be managed wasn't clear. They've settled now on a fund and on a mechanism about how developed countries, which will be giving making those investments, how they can be more confident that that's not going to be wasted, and developing countries are obviously very keen to see that help their own actions have an involvement and a seat at the table about how that's distributed.
And finally, how significant are these improvements in initiatives towards transparency?
Look, really important. They were the major stumbling block in Copenhagen about what would China do. US won't take action unless there's some accountability for China. Now we've got standard international guidelines, processes for technical experts to review what's going on there. So very important.
A big turnaround for China on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, there was probably some confusion in what they were saying in Copenhagen as well, but it's actually very important that they've made those commitments and commitments to their targets, which are actually quite strong, their commitments to clean up their development pathway.
So finally, what are the challenges then for next year?
Well, for next year, we've still got to, the key thing is obviously to increase the ambition, to have the commitments from countries.
The meeting we're talking about in South Africa next year.
In Durban, they have this meeting each year, and so they're back at it again next year with all sorts of negotiations as we lead up to that. There's also in March of 2012 the 20th anniversary of the Rio conference, which actually set up the UN Convention. So what we're hoping for is to put more meat on the bones, if you like. But what's really important is that Australia now, which has been lagging and delaying and stalling, that it actually gets on with the job, and as we head into 2011, so that we can actually go to those talks which are with a clearer mechanism for how we're going to reduce our own pollution.
Just one very last thing. We're talking to Greg Hunt in the next hour. Greg Combay is putting a lot of pressure on the opposition in terms of a carbon price, settling on a carbon price. What's your call for the opposition in relation to that?
Well, we think what's clear here, and information that we've released under Freedom of Information from the Department's own analysis, that Australia's got a much stronger target than the 5% minimum that many have talked about, and what Greg Hunt and the opposition have said they could do with their direct action fund. Clearly they're going to need more mechanisms mechanisms, greater funds, or greater funds. And I think it's the sensible and economically rational thing is to have a limit and a price on pollution.